Two cups of coffee sit on the same counter. One was made from a can that cost less than $10 a pound. The other came from a bag that cost $30 a pound, sometimes more. The same word is printed on both. The same plant, in theory. And the price of one is 3 or 4 times the price of the other. That gap didn't appear overnight. It has been pulling apart, quietly, for 50 years. By the end of this, it will be clear what that higher price actually buys, why these two coffees stopped being the same product at all, and how one ordinary thing on the grocery shelf slowly split into two. Start with a fair question. Is coffee even expensive? For most of the last half-century, the honest answer was no. Go back to the early 1970s. A cup at the diner counter cost about a quarter. A pound of ground coffee in the can at the supermarket cost less than $1. And here is the part that gets forgotten. There was really only one kind of coffee. Not a cheap shelf and a premium shelf. One broad middle that almost everyone drank. The banker and the bricklayer poured from cans that were, for practical purposes, the same coffee. To see how that one thing became two, it helps to know what is actually inside the can, because not all coffee beans are the same. Almost all of it comes from two species. One is called Arabica. It grows high up, slowly, in cool mountain air, and it tastes rounder, sweeter, a little bright. It is also delicate, fussy, and expensive to grow. The other is called robusta. It grows lower down, faster. In the heat, it shrugs off pests and disease. It carries roughly twice the caffeine, and it tastes harder and more bitter. It is also cheaper. Not a little cheaper. Robusta usually runs 30 to 40% below Arabica. None of that is a moral judgment. It is farming. One plant is simply more work to raise than the other. Then there is a second layer, and this is the one that really separates a good cup from a cheap one. It is not just which bean, but what happens to it, where it grew, and how high. Whether the ripe cherries were picked by hand, one by one, or stripped off the branch all at once, ripe and unripe together. Whether the defective beans were sorted out or left in. How fresh it is. Whether it was roasted last week or sitting in a warehouse for a year. Whether anyone ever checked it for mold. Good coffee tastes better because almost every one of those steps was done the slow, careful, expensive way. Cheap coffee is cheap because that is exactly where the corners get cut. Hold that thought, because the price story runs right through it. Measured against a paycheck, the cheap coffee in the can barely moved for decades. Adjusted for the rising cost of everything else, a pound of supermarket ground coffee was actually cheaper in 2019 than it was back in 1980. It did not really get more expensive. In real terms, it got cheaper. And while it drifted down, a second kind of coffee was climbing away from it in the other direction. So here is where the real answer begins. Why does the good bag cost what it does? Not because of shipping, not because of the label. The answer is in the bean and in everything that happens to it. And it is worth walking through step by step because each step is a cost that is very hard to make cheaper. It starts on the mountain. The best Arabica grows high, sometimes over a mile up. Up there, the air is cool and the cherries ripen slowly, and that slow ripening is what packs the bean with sugar and flavor. But steep, high ground cannot be farmed by machine. It has to be worked by people. Then comes the picking. On a specialty farm, the pickers take only the cherries that are fully ripe and leave the rest to come back for later. That means walking the same rows again and again across a season, choosing fruit by color, by hand. Compare that to the cheap end, where a machine or a crew strips the whole branch in one pass, ripe, unripe, leaves and all, and sorts out the mess later, if at all. After picking, the good beans are cleaned and dried with care, sometimes washed, sometimes fermented in a controlled way to build flavor, and that takes water, time, and know-how. Then they are sorted, and the defective beans, the broken ones, the moldy ones, the underripe ones, are pulled out and thrown away. Every defect removed is a bean the farmer grew and does not get paid for. That lost coffee is a cost too. Then the sorted beans are graded. To be called specialty, a coffee has to score at least 80 points out of 100 on a formal tasting scale, judged by trained graders. Ordinary commodity coffee never has to pass that test. And even after all that, there is freshness. Good coffee is roasted in small batches with a roast date on the bag because it is meant to be drunk within weeks, at its peak. Cheap coffee is built to survive a year on a shelf, which is a different goal entirely. Add it all up, and the reason good coffee is expensive is almost boring in how simple it is. Nearly every step is human labor and thrown away beans, and human labor and waste are the two things a factory can never quite automate away. You are not paying for a fancy word. You are paying for all the coffee that got left on the branch or picked out of the batch. But the cheap side of the shelf was moving the whole time too, in the opposite direction. The mass market brands spent 50 years doing the reverse of everything just described. They leaned harder on cheaper robusta in their blends. They pushed instant coffee, which uses less bean per cup. They bought and brewed at enormous scale. And here is one of the quieter moves. Look at the can. What used to be a 16-ounce pound slowly became a 13-ounce can, then an 11-ounce can, with the same familiar look and the same shelf price. The number on the front stayed calm, while the coffee inside shrank. That is a large part of how the cheap cup was kept cheap. A handful of big companies were steering it, and they were optimizing for cost, not for the cup. It is not that the cheap stuff never spiked. A hard frost in Brazil in 1975 killed off a huge share of the trees, and by 1977, the price of a pound in the store had jumped to around $4, but it came back down. The long trend, for decades, was flat to falling. So on one side of the aisle, coffee was being made a little cheaper and a little thinner every year, and on the other, a new kind of coffee was being built to be as good as it could possibly be, and priced accordingly. That is the gap. That is the two tracks. And the upper track is genuinely new. This is the surprising part. The kind of careful, single-origin, roast-dated coffee that fills that $30 bag did not really exist as its own category in the 1970s. The roasters who built it, names like Intelligentsia, Counterculture, and Stumptown, mostly opened between the middle 1990s and the early 2000s. The expensive shelf is not the old coffee that got pricier. It is a whole new shelf that split off and climbed. There is even a strange trigger buried in the history. In 1989, an international agreement that had been holding coffee prices up collapsed. Prices crashed and stayed low for years. And that crash is part of what pushed some growers and roasters to build a separate, higher quality market in the first place. A place where better beans could earn a better price instead of drowning in a flood of cheap ones. The bottom fell out, and the top branched off in response. Then, recently, something hit both tracks at once. In 2024 and 2025, the price of green coffee, the raw, unroasted bean that both the cheap can and the fancy bag start from, went to record highs. Drought in Brazil, a shortfall of robusta in Vietnam, the lowest warehouse stockpiles in years. In early 2025, the benchmark Arabica price passed $4 a pound, the highest level ever recorded. On top of that came a 50% tariff on coffee coming from Brazil, the single biggest supplier to the United States, in place from August of 2025 until it was lifted that November. All of it landed on both kinds of coffee. By April of 2026, the average price of ground coffee in American stores reached $9.72 a pound, the highest it has ever been. The same shock pushed on both tracks, but it did not push them equally, and it did not erase the gap that 50 years had built. It just made the whole picture harder to ignore. Now, one thing has to be said plainly, because it cuts the other way. A high price is not proof of a good cup. Some of the most expensive coffee is expensive for reasons that have nothing to do with quality. Take the little capsules and pods. Work out what they cost by the pound, and it lands somewhere around $40, $50, even $80 a pound, often for perfectly ordinary coffee sealed in plastic. Or take the bags wrapped in heavy branding, a flag on the tin, a story on the label, selling for $15 or $20. Much of that premium is the story, not the bean, and the coffee inside can carry the very same cheap robusta and dark roast as the budget can 2 shelves over. And then there is the far end of the scale, the so-called cat coffee, kopi luwak, made from beans eaten and passed by a small animal, sold for hundreds of dollars a pound as the rarest cup on earth. One food critic who tried it said it tasted like stale supermarket coffee. It is expensive because it is rare and strange, not because it is good. Expensive and good, it turns out, are not the same word either. Put the two tracks side by side, and a bigger pattern shows through. One everyday thing quietly became two. A cheap version, hollowed out a little more with every passing decade, kept within reach of almost everyone. And a real version, built back up to what coffee can actually be, drifting steadily further from the average cart. The same name on both, and a widening distance in between. It is worth remembering how little of that $30 bag, or even that $10 can, ever reaches the person who grew it. On a $4 cup, the farmer at the very start of the chain often keeps around 4 cents. About 2/3 of American adults drink coffee every single day, most of it first thing in the morning, most of it barely thought about. And underneath that ordinary habit, the shelf has been asking a quiet question for 50 years. What happens to a thing everyone uses when its cheapest version keeps getting a little thinner, and its best version keeps drifting a little further out of reach? 2 cups on the same counter, the same word on both, and half a century sitting in the space between them.